You can choose professionalism or you can choose consequences. I'm asking you one last time. Am I free to go? Think carefully before you escalate this.
Where did you get that uniform? The question echoed through the quiet afternoon at a small gas station on the outskirts of Fort Cavazos. Texas. Nusi Rands. No commotion. Just another ordinary day. March 18. Lansin Learjast. Staff Sergeant Malachi Boone. U.S. Marin. Stood beside his vehicle at pump number 4, quietly filling up before heading back to base. He wore his full field uniform name tag clearly visible, rank neatly pinned to his sleeve. Not to show off, not to draw attention. He had just left an administrative appointment at base and stopped at the gas station, as was the habit of hundreds of servicemen in the area. Across the street, in a parked patrol car, Officer Daryl Kinkin observed the gas station. On paper, he was a proactive officer with years of experience. But when his gaze fell on the man in uniform filling up the gas, his thought wasn't a soldier. It was suspicion. The patrol car pulled into the gas station. Boone recognized it instantly. His military instincts made him aware of every movement, but he didn't show any anxiety. He had nothing to hide. The car door opened. "Hey, you in the uniform." The officer's voice rang out. Boone turned, keeping his hands in a visible position, his back straight as per training. "Yes, sir." The officer approached, his eyes scanning Boone's face, not his rank, not his name tag. "Where did you get that uniform?" In that moment, the atmosphere changed. This was no longer a routine inspection, no longer a polite encounter. That was the moment an assumption was formed, and just minutes later, that very assumption would trigger a chain of events that extended beyond this small gas station, beyond the authority of a local police officer, and all the way to the Pentagon. "I'm active duty, sir. United States Marine Corps." Officer Sergeant Malachi Boone answered decisively, his voice calm and undefensive. It wasn't the answer of someone trying to justify themselves, but the affirmation of someone accustomed to discipline and responsibility. But the officer's tone didn't change. "Ooh-ha. People like you. They sell this stuff online all the time. Don't get smart with me." The phrase, "people like you," hung in the air. No one mentioned skin color, but everyone understood the implication. Boone didn't react. "I'm just filling up with gas, sir." No calls from civilians. No suspicious reports. No clear legal reason for this approach. Yet the officer continued to move closer, beginning to ask questions as if it were an interrogation. "Where do you live? Address. Where are you from?" Boone answered each question clearly and distinctly. The police officer repeated the address slowly, as if waiting for a mistake, a discrepancy. "You know that impersonating a military officer is a felony." "Right. Yes, I know." That was the moment when things crossed the line of verification. Once someone has decided that the other person is lying, every answer becomes evidence against them. The police officer glanced at Boone's car, then turned back. "Step away from the vehicle." Boone paused slightly. "For what reason?" "Sir." The police officer's gaze hardened. "Because I told you to." Not the law, not procedure, but personal power. Boone looked around. The people at the pump next to him had stopped talking. Inside the store, the cashier stood still, watching through the glass. Boone took a deep breath, then complied. He set the pump nozzle down, stepped back, his hands still in sight. In that moment, something very important happened. A serving soldier, in his proper uniform, Obeyed not because he was wrong, but because he understood that any reaction could be interpreted as resistance. And the policeman, in that silence, understood that he held the full advantage. Turn around. Face the car. The order was brief. Without explanation. Without citing any legal basis. Just a voice accustomed to obedience. Boone turned around as requested. Slowly, controlling each movement, his hands remained in a visible position, exactly as he had been trained to do during his years of service. "Am I being detained?" he asked. His voice, even, not provocative. The officer didn't answer directly. "Right now. You're being investigated." A vague phrase. Enough to justify any subsequent action, but not enough to specify any particular crime. The atmosphere around the gas station became heavy. The only sounds remaining were the engines of cars passing by on Harrison Parkway and the faint metallic clanging against the pumps in the wind. A woman at the pump across the street pulled out her phone, raised it, and began recording. "Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't make any sudden moves." Boone nodded. "I'm obeying." "Sir." The officer moved closer, standing right behind him. Too close. So close that Boone could feel the breath on the back of his neck. "Interlace your fingers behind your head." Boone complied. Slowly, clearly, without a single superfluous movement, palms resting on his uniform cap, elbows extended, a familiar posture from intense training sessions in dangerous environments. In that moment, Boone was no longer a civilian filling up a gas station. He was being treated as a suspect. The officer's hand suddenly grabbed Boone's left wrist, yanking it sharply backward. "Sir," Boone said, keeping his voice low, "I'm cooperating. Please loosen your grip." There was no response. The other wrist was pulled down, higher than necessary. Boone's shoulders tensed. But he didn't resist. The sound of metal echoed. Handcuffs snapped shut behind his back. A serving soldier, in full uniform, handcuffed in public, not for a crime, but for an unproven suspicion. The woman who had been turning spoke. "Why are you cuffing him? He hasn't done anything." The officer turned his head. "Ma'am, mind your business." Boone stood still, his gaze fixed straight ahead. In that moment, the line between law enforcement and abuse of power was crossed. And from then on, things would no longer be as simple as a checkup. The officer began searching him. Not a quick search, but a slow, rough motion, as if trying to find something, anything, to justify his decision. His hand lingered longer than necessary at his waist. In his jacket pocket, Boone stood still, jaw clenched, maintaining his posture. "Are you carrying a weapon?" "No." "Sir, my weapons are stored at the base." The officer smirked. "So you say—" He reached into Boone's front pocket and pulled out his military ID. "Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, active duty." He looked at the ID, then at Boone's face, then at the ID again, as if waiting for something to mismatch. "You don't look like the kind of person they'd normally give responsibility to," he said softly, almost murmuring. Boone didn't answer, but his neck tensed. The officer turned his back and pressed the radio. "Dispatch. Run the name. Malachi Boone. Date of birth." He read slowly, as if still hoping for a misidentification. While they waited, another patrol car pulled into the gas station. A young officer got out, glanced at Boone, then at his uniform. "He looks legit," he said, his voice hesitant. The older officer glanced over. "That's how they get people." Boone spoke up. for the first time taking the initiative. I've served 14 years. I've had 2 overseas deployments. I'm not impersonating anyone. No one answered. Then the radio crackled. Unit 214. Subject confirmed. Active duty Marine. Assigned to Fort Cavazos. No warrants. The answer was clear. No ambiguity. Undoubtedly. A few seconds of silence followed. The handcuffs were still there. The officer looked at Boone. His gaze cold. Run it again. Dispatch already confirmed. The voice on the radio replied. He's active duty. The woman filming stepped forward. Then why is he still handcuffed? There was no answer. At that moment, it was no longer a matter of identity verification. Identity had been proven. The truth had been confirmed. But a person's personal power still rested above the law. And that was turning an initial mistake into a serious violation. No further questions. No apology. No attempt to remove the handcuffs. The officer grasped the chain between the handcuffs and pulled Staff Sergeant Malachi Boone toward the patrol car. Follow me. Boone walked slowly but steadily. At the nearby pump, a couple whispered to each other. Inside the convenience store, the cashier had left the counter and was watching through the glass. The woman filming continued to speak. He's been confirmed as an active duty soldier. Why are you still holding him? The officer turned, his voice sharp. Ma'am, step back. Boone spoke, his voice calm, almost cold. Sir, dispatch has confirmed my identity. I have not committed any crime. The officer stopped, turning to face Boone. His gaze hardened. You're not at base. He opened the back door of the patrol car. Out here. I'm in charge. Not a legal statement. It was an assertion of power. Boone asked again. Slowly, clearly. Am I under arrest? There was no answer. Only a sharp shove to the back. Boone's shoulder hit the car door frame. A soft "oh" escaped from those around him. The recording phone didn't vibrate. The car door slammed shut. Inside. Boone sat upright, his hands still cuffed in front of him. He took a deep breath. Maintaining a steady rhythm, a survival skill not of the battlefield, but of a situation where power was being abused. Outside, the officer walked toward his car. His jaw clenched. He picked up the radio. Supervisor, I need you on scene. In that moment, he understood something, though he didn't admit it. This situation was beyond his control. It was no longer a matter of verification. No longer a matter of reasonable suspicion. But a decision had been made. And now he was forced to defend it, even when the truth was right before him. The third patrol car pulled up in front of the gas station a few minutes later. Sergeant Ronan Whitaker stepped out, his eyes scanning the scene before him, onlookers. Phones held aloft, and a soldier in uniform sitting in the back seat of the patrol car. Just by looking, he knew this wasn't an ordinary situation. What's going on? Daryl, he asked, his voice low and commanding. The officer replied quickly, but uncertainly. The subject identified himself as a soldier. Dispatch was right. But his behavior shows signs of evasion. I want to record the incident. Whitaker looked out the car window. Staff Sergeant Boone looked up. Sir. Boone said clearly, I followed all orders. I confirmed his identity from the beginning. I was handcuffed after cooperating. A woman stepped forward, her phone still ringing. I have the entire video. He did nothing wrong. Whitaker turned to look at the officer. Dispatch confirmed it. Right? The officer nodded reluctantly. So what legal reason is there to keep the handcuffs? Whitaker asked. There was no answer. Only a heavy silence. Whitaker took a deep breath. "Remove the handcuffs." The officer stood still for a moment, then opened the car door. The sound of the metal unlocking echoed small, but enough to mark the moment power began to retreat. Boone stepped out of the car. Slowly, he straightened his shirt, adjusted his hat, and stood at attention instinctively. He looked at Whitaker. "Sir, I will file a formal complaint." Whitaker nodded once. "That's your right." The officer said nothing. His gaze followed Boone back to his car. He still doesn't know that the phones around him and his recent decision will ruin his career forever. As Staff Sergeant Malachi Boone drove away from the Redstone Fuel and Mart, he didn't look back. But the incident didn't end there. The woman filming the video stood in the parking lot, her fingers swiping across her phone screen. She posted the clip with a short caption. Local police handcuffed an active-duty Marine simply because they didn't believe he was wearing his uniform legally. Within an hour, the video was circulating in local community groups. By evening, it had spread to police misconduct watch sites nationwide. The images spoke for themselves. A soldier in uniform, handcuffed, detained after his identity was confirmed. That same day, Boone returned to Fort Cavazos and reported the incident to his commanding officer. He submitted a detailed report, the time, location, names of the officers, and every order given. This wasn't a misunderstanding. He told his superior. He decided I was lying before checking anything. The next morning, the base's legal office contacted the local police department directly, requesting all body cam video, radio logs, and dispatch records for the time frame in which the incident occurred. Within the police department, the atmosphere changed almost immediately. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation. Questions began to surface not just about the gas station incident, but about other instances as well. Old, previously shelved complaints were unearthed from the filing cabinets. At the same time, the video continued to spread. It was no longer just the story of a small Texas gas station. It has become a bigger, more far-reaching question. If a person in uniform can be treated like this, then how many others have been treated like this when no one is filming? In the days that followed, Internal Affairs investigators reviewed the body cam footage repeatedly, not to find out what had happened, but to determine why it was allowed to happen. Every word, every pause, every choice of the officer was dissected. The initial, unprovoked approach, the suspicious tone from the very first question, and most importantly, the decision to keep the handcuffs on after the dispatcher had confirmed his identity. When asked why he didn't remove them immediately, the officer replied, "He questioned my authority. I saw that as evasive." The investigator paused, looking directly at him. Questioning one's own detention is not illegal. That answer opened the door to old files. Previous complaints came to light: unexplained vehicle stops, unnecessary escalations of contact, familiar phrases repeated over and over in the reports. The same type of suspicion, the same tone, the same target group. The picture gradually became clear. This was no longer a wrong decision made on a tense afternoon. This was a pattern of behavior. When the file was passed to civil rights lawyers, the language in the preliminary assessment became icy. Unjustified detention, discriminatory law enforcement, abuse of power. A few days later, the Marine Corps Office of Special Investigations sent a formal request for access to the file. Then the Department of Justice, and by the time this information reached Washington, the matter had gone beyond the purview of a local police department. The question now is no longer directed at that particular police officer, but at the entire system that allowed him to act in this way for so many years. When the case moved beyond internal affairs and was transferred to the federal level, things changed almost immediately. It was no longer a matter of internal discipline. It was no longer a performance review. It was a matter of civil rights. Thanks for watching. Department of Justice launched a formal criminal investigation. Federal prosecutors requested subpoenas for the officer's entire personal record, including complaint history, performance reviews, and cases previously classified as unsubstantiated. At the same time, the Pentagon issued a brief but powerful statement. The Department of Defense is closely monitoring the case, involving an active duty service member being unlawfully detained by local law enforcement and is cooperating with the Department of Justice. Just a short statement. But the message was clear. This matter could no longer be downplayed. The officer was placed on paid leave. His badge and weapons were confiscated. At the police station, colleagues who had become accustomed to his presence began to distance themselves, some out of anxiety, some out of fear of being implicated, some because, for the first time, they realized this time things were truly different. On the other side of the city, Staff Sergeant Boone received a call from a federal prosecutor. "We're preparing to prosecute this case as a violation of civil rights under the guise of power. Are you willing to testify?" Boone looked at the uniform hanging neatly in the locker. "I'm willing," he replied. "Not just for myself, but for others who aren't on camera." From that moment, the path was laid out. There was no turning back. And the next time that police officer walks into the office with the federal agents, he will no longer be in the position of asking questions, but in the position of answering. The federal courtroom in Waco, Texas, was so quiet you could hear the rustling of papers. The police officer, once accustomed to standing on the street with his hands on his hips, now sat at the defendant's table in a dark suit. No uniform, no badge. Just a man facing the very legal system he once represented. His old badge was sealed in an evidence bag. The federal prosecutor rose, his voice calm but sharp. "This case isn't about a mistake, not about a stressful day at work. It's about a choice." The jury listened intently. The indictment was read clearly, article by article. Deprivation of civil rights under the guise of power. Unlawful detention. Using unnecessary force. False reporting. Each charge was accompanied by a specific prison sentence. The defense attorney tried to construct a familiar argument. The police were overly cautious, concerned about safety, uncertain about identity. The prosecutor immediately countered. Caution does not explain keeping the handcuffs after the identity has been confirmed. Caution does not explain the demeaning language. And caution never allows a person to be detained without legal grounds. Body cam footage was shown. The entire courtroom heard again the question that had started it all. "Where'd you get that uniform?" Then came the statement that made many in the room frown. "You people always have an answer." No comment needed. No explanation needed. The images and words were enough in themselves. When the video ended, silence fell over the room. It was no longer a gas station story. That was the moment when power was brought into the light and there was nowhere left to hide. Staff Sergeant Malachi Boone stepped up to the witness stand in his formal attire. He didn't look around the courtroom. He didn't seek sympathetic glances. He showed no emotion. His posture was straight, his voice clear, just as he had reported after every mission. "I followed every order," Boone said. "I kept my hands in a visible position. I answered every question. I presented my documents. I didn't resist." The prosecutor asked, What made you realize this was no longer a legal examination? Boone paused. When my identity was confirmed, but I was still handcuffed. In the courtroom, a few people nodded slightly. The defense attorney stood up, trying to steer the conversation. Do you admit that you questioned the officer's authority? Boone answered immediately, without hesitation. Yes, because I have the right to ask why I'm being detained. And that might make the officer feel challenged. Boone looked straight ahead. If asking about my rights is considered a challenge, then it's not my fault. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed. The prosecutor concluded with a brief argument. This case doesn't require the jury to believe in emotion. Just look at the sequence of events. Identity confirmed. No guilty. But liberty has been taken. The jury left the room. The wait felt endless. When they returned, the entire courtroom rose. The verdict was read word by word. Guilty. Not just one charge, but all the major charges. There was no cheering, no applause. There was only the silence of a moment when the truth was confirmed and power, for the first time in this story, had no voice. On sentencing day, the federal courtroom fell silent once more. The police officer, once accustomed to giving orders, once accustomed to standing on the streets with power in his hands, now stood before the dock, head bowed, awaiting the verdict. Judge Eleanor Whitcomb looked directly at the defendant. You were given authority under the Constitution, she said slowly, but you used that authority to deprive a human being of their liberty not because of a crime, but because of prejudice. She paused. That was not a professional error. That was a betrayal. The sentence was pronounced 70 years in federal prison. A murmur spread through the courtroom. The defendant's knees buckled slightly as the U.S. Marshals advanced. Handcuffs were fastened exactly as he had done to others. This time, no one asked a question. No one doubted. On the other side of the courtroom, Staff Sergeant Malachi Boone rose with military reflex. Back straight. Eyes calm. No gloating. No anger. Just the silence of someone who understood that what had just happened wasn't a personal victory, but a principle being upheld. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Boone. He said only one short sentence. This was never revenge. It was responsibility. The uniform I wear represents the promise that every citizen is equally protected by the law. Today, that promise has been fulfilled. The prisoner transport vehicle rolled away from the courthouse. A gas station. A prejudiced question. A misused badge. And a reminder that resonated more than any sentence. No one is above the law, not even those entrusted with its enforcement. If you believe that justice only exists when someone dares to speak up, please share this story. Because sometimes, it is a phone held up in the middle of the day that keeps justice from being handcuffed.